describe when you heard about Pearl Harbor?
Well, I was working at Camp Barkeley, that Abilene, building that camp. And when they hit Pearl Harbor, I told my boss and my friend that I was going to draw up the next day and go home and figure out what outfit I was going to join. And he said he could get me a deferment, but told him there wasn't any deferment from that. After what they had done at Pearl Harbor, I was ready for them. And I drew up the next morning and went home, and several of my buddies had done the same thing. And it took us about 3 weeks to figure out what we were going to do. And we were listening to Wake Island and all that the Marines were doing, defending those islands out there. So we decided to join the Marines, and 4 of us went to Oklahoma City, and the first day of January '42, we joined the Marines. Next thing I was on that train heading for camp.
Could you describe some of your training experiences? Where did you go, and what was the training like?
We went to Marine boot camp and base training in San Diego. And that's where we took our boot training, was in San Diego, our basic training. And when we got through with basic training, we went out to Camp Elliot, which was a temporary Marine camp. And they had several camps, and there was so many coming in at one time that they couldn't have bases for all of them, and so they just scattered out everywhere. And around San Diego, there was 3 Army divisions, and then 2 Marine camps, and then of course right across the channel was the Navy base. And if you got to leave and went to town in San Diego, you'd never see anybody but servicemen. And they'd be coming down the sidewalk, and usually they'd gather 4 to 6 in a row. That many sailors, or that many Marines, or that many soldiers. And you'd never see them mix. And you'd always see them in a group. And you walk in a bar in San Diego, and I paid a bar or 2. I did drink 1 or 2 beers. I never did get drunk. But you walk in, well, it'd be a table of sailors, table of Marines, table of soldiers, and you'd never see any civilians or any women. All you'd see is servicemen, right after the war started. And we just out of boot camp, because you didn't go to town until you got out of boot camp. But then we went to Camp Elliot and did additional training, and from there, that 2nd Marine Regiment was formed, and we went aboard 3 different ships. And our particular unit went aboard the USS Jackson, which was a converted luxury liner. And we went aboard ship, and we spent 31 days on that ship. And that's the longest time. But even there, I was lucky. I didn't have to stay down in the hold with all those 7 decks of men. There was bunks 7 high and 300 men in a hold. It was designed for cabins, for passengers. But because they knew I was a carpenter, well, they put me up I got me a bunk in the carpenter shop up on the forecastle. And my job was to repair the Higgins boats and ramp gliders and all the stuff that was damaged in our training, so we'd have them when we hit first. And the only place that we hit before we went to Guadalcanal was Samoan Islands. And we got to go, I think, 5 or 6 hours, as long as you could stay. But so many men would go ashore, and when they go back, another group would go ashore.
So you stopped at the Samoan Islands on
We
your
stopped
way
in
to
the
Guadalcanal?
Samoan Islands when we were at Guadalcanal. And when we left Samoa, the next island we hit was the Solomon Islands, which was Guadalcanal and Tulagi and Gavutu and Tanambogo.
Good.
And our group did not hit Guadalcanal. We hit Tanambogo, Gavutu, and Tulagi Islands, which was the Jap headquarters, and most of the officers were there. Over on Guadalcanal is a much bigger island, and it had an airstrip, but it was more jungles and wasn't as well populated. And Tulagi had been the British mandated capital of the Solomon Islands. They belonged to the British. And but of course, during the invasion, there wasn't hardly anything left when we got the island secure. And the Japs were mostly heading out into the island in caves, and it took about 10 days to get them all cleaned out. But the headquarters area we cleaned out in a hurry, and they set up a headquarters. And my first job was to gather up all that scattered buildings and make a mess hall and a cook shack, and then officers' quarters. But always your mess hall and your cook shack came first. Cook shack first, then mess hall, and then if I had any time left, I'd build an officers' quarters. But just about the time we got that all secured and built, well then we went on our Higgins boats and went across Sea Lark Channel to Guadalcanal. And I spent nearly 6 months there.
Could you explain some of your experiences while you were in Guadalcanal?
Well, it was hurry up and wait deals, mostly jungle fighting. And what we'd do would be to so many men, so many platoons, so many companies would advance and then have to secure all of that and clean out all those. There's so many hiding places for the Japs, and it was a lot of jungles and a lot of creeks, and you'd fight a day or two, and then you'd stay at what we call a base or a camp for so many days. And being at headquarters in special duty, well, a lot of our duties, my duties, were take my men, and we would, there were just 2 or 3 jeeps there wasn't any ambulances or any transportation, 1 or 2 old trucks that called ammunition, but no men. And we'd have to carry all of our wounded back on stretchers. And it wasn't bad at first, but further down that island we'd get, the further you'd have to carry them. And it was more day-to-day living in those jungles than it was fighting. We'd advance so far and clear out an area, and our orders were always the same, and that was to take as many Japs as we could for interrogation.
Were you ever successful in doing that?
For one thing, it was a fight to finish each time, and if you did take a prisoner, a lot of times he'd take his own life, because it was a disgrace for them to surrender at that time. And very few prisoners we ever took on Guadalcanal and Tulagi. We took a few before we went across to Guadalcanal. While we're still on Tulagi, there's a big island called Florida Island. It was a lot bigger than Tulagi, and it was mostly jungles. And if they sunk a Jap ship or shot an aviator down, or any time the Japs that escaped from Tanambogo and Gavutu and Tulagi would go across to Florida. Well, they'd hide out and live off the natives. And the natives would slip away and send their runners, and I got a picture here of some runners that come over and some of those native guys, and they'd, you go with us, we'll show you. And I volunteered for several of those trips over on Florida Island, because when you go over there and clean out a nest of those Japs, well, those natives would feed you royally. And our ship supplies had run out days and days before supply ships ever came in. And we lived off of 1 or 2 cans of sea rations a day for about 3 weeks there. But anyway, I volunteered for all of those because you always get something good to eat if you were over there. Mostly coconuts and bananas, but they did have quite a few pigs, and they'd always roast a pig for you when you go over there. So that was special. If you got rid of the Japs, well, they'd feed you.
What was your first impression of combat? How did you react to that?
Well, my first combat was on Gavutu and Tanambogo and those little islands, and it was fast and furious and over with before you really had time to think. But several guys from my company got hit, and I was just one of the lucky ones. And after it was secure, well, I slept on top of a grave at a cemetery there in Tulagi, where they'd buried natives for several years, and some of the British that had served there. But they had a few slabs, stones, but mostly just cross. But that's soft ground, so I slept on the top of one of those graves with blankets. But my first fighting was on Gavutu and Tanambogo and then Tulagi. And really I didn't have time to think much. You just reacted, and your reaction was strictly from your training. And as a well-trained group of men. And we had good men and good officers. And the fighting didn't last that long. And then we went to Guadalcanal, and the fighting there was long and drawn out, but it's just in spurts. And mostly cleaning out pockets of Japs. And the biggest group that we got was 432 Japs in one pocket on a little point on the island there. And it was heavy jungles, and they were dug in, and that took several days.
What was your impression of the Japanese soldier?
Well, they were dedicated fighters, but they weren't smart. They were trained, but if they didn't have an officer telling them what to do, they didn't know what to do. And like I say, they were dedicated soldiers, that group was. But they weren't smart. And you could outfox them and trick them into most anything you wanted to do. And the fact that they were trained not to surrender, well, they just come in head first, you know, ready to kill you or die, and we let them die. A lot of them. I think in all, we had, in all of Guadalcanal, in as much as 6 months, we had one camp that had about 30-some odd Jap prisoners in it. And that's of all the thousands of troops that were there. So there wasn't any surrender. They fought till you killed them. So we made it as handy for them as we could.
Any other experiences from Guadalcanal?
Well, the worst thing that happened to me on Guadalcanal was mosquitoes and malaria. And by the time I'd been there, that third or fourth month, I started having chills and fever. And that was the most miserable part of it. But then some scientists came out with Adabrin, which was a substitute for quinine. But it was a little yellow pill, and if I took one of them, my skin would turn yellow. So the corpsman in our outfit was an old boy from Memphis, Texas, down here, and he was a Navy corpsman, and he and I got to be pretty good buddies. And he got a hold of a big supply of quinine, and he gave me 3 bottles of quinine, and I carried them in my pocket. That's the quickest way to kill that malaria. And after I finally got back to the States after several years, I pretty well had it down to the point where I didn't have any more chills or fevers, and I never had any after I got back to the States.
Sounds nasty.
But that malaria was wicked,
Sounds
and
nasty.
it knocked a lot of them out. And quite a few of the first people that were sent home, wounded, and troops, there's quite a few malaria cases sent home. And they offered to send me home from Hawaii, and I said, go away. And the second goes home, I'll go home.
Well, after Guadalcanal, where were you stationed next? Where would they send you to?
They sent us to New Zealand.
And what was that like?
That was paradise. New Zealand was a good climate, it was cool and clean, and everything was clean. And as I said, the New Zealand had been, and Australia had joined England in North Africa, and they had been at war for 2 years. And the ratio of women to men were about 6 or 7 to 1. All of the eligible men were fighting in Africa. And that made it very pleasant for a bunch of Marines that hadn't seen a white woman in 6 months.
So how long did you stay in New Zealand?
We spent, I've got it written down here somewhere, we stayed in New Zealand about 6 months. We stayed long enough to get enough reinforcements and trained to go into combat again. And that was a real pleasant place to train. And the climate was good, and there were some pretty rugged hills and stuff to train in. New Zealand Alps down there were pretty tall. You know, New Zealand Alps on South Island stayed snow-capped year-round. But on North Island, it was good climate and a good place to train, and the people that lived there were great. And to them, we had stopped the Japs from coming on down. So they treated us as heroes, and it was great all the time we spent there. Except the first month there I spent building Camp Barkeley because I was a regimental carpenter. But after I got that built, well then I got a 30-day leave and got to go to South Island and got to go to Christchurch, New Zealand, which was simply deluxe. And I think that of all of the places to go for entertainment, the they wouldn't let you, your money was no good. I'll get that yank, I'll get that yank. You didn't pay for anything, and even the hotel we stayed at charged us half rates. And we rented a little 10 horsepower, 4-cylinder English Ford. And we drove around, and it wouldn't get very fast, but it got good mileage. And everybody gave us our gas ration cards. And we drove nearly all over that South Island in that little old Ford. And we had a blast. But then we had to go back and start training again, and from there we went to Tarawa.
What was your impression of the Marines' ability to retrain and replace the suit? What was your impression of the replacement troops? Do you think the replacement troops were incorporated well into the unit to maintain unit cohesion?
They sure did, and they come right in, and there's enough seasoned veterans that everybody kicked in and helped. And it just didn't have a big sergeant there yelling at them and telling them what to do. Every man in the outfit helped them out. And you worked as a unit. Everything was a unit. And that's one reason that our units worked so well in combat, because we worked together as a unit wherever we were and whatever we did. And even though I was 1st Battalion Carpenter, later on Regimental Carpenter, I still trained the recruits when they come in. And the guys that we were training were nearly all at that time enlistees. They weren't drafted. There's one thing about the Marines. There was nearly all of it, until we'd been at war a long time, they didn't take draft men in the Marines. They were all enlistees, and they came in there for one reason, and that was to be a Marine and to fight Japs. And they were easy to train, they were eager to train. And there was only a few of them that didn't, some men have 2 left feet, and some of them are just not military adaptable. And those guys were the ones I turned into carpenters. And they were runners and errand boys, and they worked in the mess hall and all different jobs like that, and worked as clerks or whatever around base headquarters, and then they helped me on whatever projects I had to do. But as a whole, they were a great bunch of guys, and they were all joined the Marines for one reason, and that they were willing to train to do that. And very few of them didn't go right straight into line companies and squads and learn first, and that's the first thing they tell you when you join the Marines. You're first a rifleman and a Marine, and then you're a specialist. And we had a lot of good, by that time, guys with enough experience that they knew what to train. And we lost a lot of men, so we had a lot of replacements coming in. But the thing about it, most of them were young men. The original group of 2nd Marines were a lot of men my age. They were older men. See, I was 25 or 6 when I joined, and had a good civilian job. But the volunteers that came in right after the war were mostly older men, and later on they were drafted men and recruits. But the nucleus, there was enough of the regulars and older men to train the new ones as they came in.
To maintain good unit cohesion.
And it made, and the men that you trained were the men you went into battle with. And you didn't go to an Army training camp or a Marine training camp, get trained and get sent off. In other words, you trained your men and took them with you. And that makes for a good outfit because you understood them where to go. And we had a great bunch of guys.
So after the training of the replacements, you mentioned that the next stop you went to was Tarawa.
We went to Tarawa.
So what was your experiences there?
Well, as a special duty headquarters man, I didn't go in with the original troops. I went in on the second day, and that's probably the reason I'm still here, because there's sure a lot of the first troops that went ashore on Tarawa got killed.
Could you describe what you saw when you landed? What the scene was like?
A lot of the bodies, mostly. And the other thing is that terrain was rugged, and those Amtraks couldn't come in and get up. And you had to, we went in on Higgins boats and those Amtraks, and we had to go in water from here up to here to there, and wade in and hold your equipment up. And if you were lucky if you got ashore and had time to dig a foxhole before you got shot at. But it was pretty rugged even the second day there and third day. But at the end of the third day, they already had bulldozers on that airstrip, cleaned it off and landed planes there.
While the fighting was still going on?
Day.
Really?
That was, I guess, percentage-wise, we lost more men in a shorter time than any other battle we were ever in. And I consider myself lucky that I didn't go in with the original troops, because very few of them survived. But it boils down a lot to luck, but most of it is training. And the guys that came off of Tarawa all remember that. And they remember that more than they did Guadalcanal or Saipan or Tinian or any of the other battles, because it was short and rugged.
How long were you in Tarawa? About?
As quick as it was secured,
Okay.
the main troops left, and then the maintenance men came in, and what were they called? Specialists. The guys that maintained the tractors and graders and trucks, and all the maintenance men came in and they rebuilt the island to use as an air base, because they had a good airstrip there, big enough that big planes could land on it. Even though the island was small, it was a big strip there, and it was a good strip. And so mostly the maintenance men and the Navy Seabees and Marine specialists came in, and they're the ones that stayed after the island was secure. But after it was secure, there was a handful of prisoners, because they were dug in and they fought till you killed them. They just didn't surrender. And it was fast and nasty, but it was over quick.
And where did you go after after Tarawa? What was your next assignment?
The next assignment was Hawaii. And that was a great place to be, but our camp was around on the north end of the big island, and it was length the island away from the Hilo or any, and there was 2 or 3 little villages along the beach there, not more than 200 or 300 people in any of them, and no cafes, no nightclubs, no place to go on leave, and it was too far to go unless you had a week's pass to go to Hilo and spend any time there. But at that time there was more service personnel than there were civilians in Hilo, Army, Navy, and Marines. And we got in trouble when we landed at Hilo anyway. Our ships pulled in. The ships we left the States on, we went to Guadalcanal on. We went from there to New Zealand on, from there to Tarawa, and there to Hawaii. Same ship, USS Jackson. The only ship that I was ever on until the ships we caught to come home. But when we pulled in the port there, of course, you wore your khaki or dungarees, and in combat you never wore any insignia. I never had a sergeant stripe on anything until I got this uniform after I got back to base camp in San Diego. I had one shirt that had sergeant stripes on it, but I didn't wear it because excuse me, the Japs were trained to kill officers and sergeants, and they would risk their own life to kill an officer or a sergeant before half a dozen regulars. That's what they were trained to do. And so you wore no insignia, but your own outfit everybody knew you because you were together all those months and months of training. So we were in our dungarees and sitting on our sea bags in the port there in Hilo, and they were unloading the gear off the ship, and they had some Army troops out there that was their duty to unload those ships, and we were led around on our sea bags waiting on our gear, and there's several officers there and quite a few NCOs, everything up to sergeant major, but no insignia. And those guys unloading that ship, wow, you know, help us unload these ships. Yeah. And they all had their insignias on there, corporals and sergeants. Why should we unload your stuff? Get over here. And we got over there, but we just tossed them out in the water. And of course, they loaded us on their trucks and took us to camp there, and we weren't allowed to go back to Hilo.
That was that.
That was over with so quick and easy, it was funny. Well, there's quite a few of us, and there's just a few of them, but they were bad-mouthing us.
The dispatcher.
Privates laying over on the sea bags, and us NCOs doing this work. That was funny. It wasn't funny later because we were restricted. We couldn't even go to Hilo. They put us on those trucks and took us around to that north end of that island, and there's that bare ground and no buildings, stacks of tents and lumber. and that's where I would work. I worked and I worked and I worked there. And then my crew, and the rest of them started training, and of course the first thing you did was build strong backs and tent decks and strong backs. And then the cookshack, and then in the officers' quarters, but it took nearly 2 months to build that camp because it's a pretty big camp. And the basis of that camp is still there. Because I talked to this guy later down in Oklahoma City that was stationed there for a while, and it's called Camp Tarawa. But I built it, I was ramrodding it. Of course, I was laying it out and only made the cuts on the rafters and stuff that easier to do than it was to tell them how. But after 1 or 2 bases, well, it was pretty fast building those tent decks and strong backs because the guys were pretty well up to it by then. But we could set up a camp pretty fast. But we never moved into a camp. It was always bare ground and equipped. But I built a lot of camps in that. I helped build a lot of camps in that specific area. But that Camp Tarawa there on Hawaii is the last one that I worked on because after we left there and went to Saipan and Tinian, well, I had my last spell of malaria on Tinian, and they flew me that trip back over to the hospital on Saipan. They had a big, nearly everything there was sugar land, and they had 2 big sugar factories there on Saipan. And Garapan is a pretty good sized village, but most of the industry there was connected with agriculture and sugar. And they turned that sugar factory into a base hospital, and I had a couple of spells of malaria there. And they threatened to send me, after a certain length of time, guys have malaria. They set up a big base hospital back on Guadalcanal, the first one we took. And that's where they sent guys to recuperate and recover, and they sent guys with malaria back there. And captain threatened to send me back to Guadalcanal if I didn't start taking my quinine. But anyway, that last spell of malaria I had was on Tinian, and that was the day before it was secured. It did take me a few days to secure Tinian because it was flatter. It wasn't as rugged as Saipan was mountainous, and there's caves everywhere. And those Japs was drug in, and it was a lot of rugged fighting there. And I've got a picture of me somewhere in here with a Jap rifle.
Is that you right there?
That's me right there. And that's a Jap submachine gun.
Let me put this in front of the camera real quick. There's a picture of Mooney on the left holding on to, looks like a Japanese machine gun.
Machine guns.
Is there a story behind that?
Well, I killed a couple of Japs, and they were in a cave, and I pulled that out of the cave after we pulled them out. You had to pull them out to be sure they were dead, because they wouldn't come out and surrender. Those two buddies there. You do most anything if a man beside you is doing his job. That means a lot. But I had one of the samurai swords that I took off of one dead chap, and I got home with it. And I kept it in my sea bag. We weren't supposed to take souvenirs, you know.
Yeah.
But I was kind of overlooked, and I got back and after I got back to the States, well, quite a while after, I built a home for one of my daughters down at Bastrop, down by Austin, and I took it down there to show, and some guy swiped it off the job.
Really? Oh. Well, what other memories stick out after all this time with your experiences in like Saipan and?
Well, most of your memories are memories of the guys you were with and the things you did together. And Saipan was a rugged fight, and it lasted a long time, and it was mountainous, and we had to dig those Japs individually out of those holes, out of those caves, all over that dead place. And I also had to only town of any size that we fought in. Everything else was islands, except Saipan, and Garapan was it was a town there, and it was several thousand people originally. And the Japs had killed a lot of them off, natives, and the Japs had moved into that thing, and any house that was any size or had any accommodations, well, the Jap officers were living in. And then if there's enough left, well, some of the Jap enlisted men were. But that town was the ruggedest place we had to take. In fact, it's the only town that we took anywhere that we fought was that one city there town there on Saipan. Tinian had a little village on it, but it was just native huts mostly. And that's where they were cleaned off that big airstrip. And Tinian is where the Enola Gay took off. It dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. And that